Oh, the ginger fist of fury struck last week as Andy Dalton had a notably poor performance against Kansas City. The Chiefs' defense entered the week having allowed 340 passing yards per game. Dalton put up 148. That is not going to pay the fantasy bills. He gets another great matchup this week against Tampa Bay. Now, Tampa's defense on the year has allowed 8.8 yards per attempt. 18 passing scores, only 1 interception. It is a very friendly matchup. We love Dalton's receivers. I do think he bounces back here, but I'm not going to give him a monster week. Let's just call it 246 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 pick. Jameis Winston gave us kind of an empty 300-yard passing performance last week, couple interceptions. A rushing touchdown helped save his fantasy week. He does have a couple of 300-yard games on the resume this year, but he also has thrown more interceptions than touchdowns. That's a small worry. Not a worry this week is the opponent. It's the Cincinnati Bengals, and they just got shredded by Patrick Mahomes. They've allowed the 5th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, about 300 passing yards per week, so it's another good spot for Winston. I think he has one of those sketchy real-life days that ends up being pretty good for fantasy purposes. I'm going to give him 310 passing yards in this one, 1 passing score, 1 pick.
Without much fanfare, my cousin Mike Evans is a top 10 fantasy wide receiver in terms of fantasy points per game. Specifically, is wide receiver 9 in that category. A player that's averaging 9.2 targets, 6.7 receptions, 98.5 yards per game, and his total 3 touchdowns. This week against the Cincinnati defense, still licking its wounds after getting obliterated by Patrick Mahomes last Sunday night. The Bengals have allowed the 13th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position and have also given up 7.5 pass yards per attempt. Evans goes for 7 catches, 90 yards, but he doesn't find the end zone. Green is definitely the color of money, and it certainly applies to the Cincinnati wide receiver, who is number 10 in terms of fantasy points per game at the position so far this year. He is averaging 9.9 targets, 5.7 receptions, 87.3 yards per game, and his total 5 touchdowns. And you look at the matchup, the Buccaneers, they're wielding soft swords so far this season in terms of coverage. They've allowed the 2nd most fantasy points, 11 touchdowns, and a 75.2 catch percentage, 2 WRs. They've also given up 8.8 pass yards per attempt. Green cashes those dollar bills, y'all. He goes for 6 catches, 99 yards, and a touchdown. Much like the Cincinnati Bengals offense as a whole, Boyd was a colossal letdown in Kansas City. But he is going to right the ship this week based on the matchup alone. Why? Well, he's facing the Buccaneers, who are right now living in Davy Jones's locker defensively. The Bucs have allowed the 2nd most fantasy points, 75.2 catch percentage, 11 total touchdowns, and 8.8 yards per attempt through the air. That's, by the way, 2nd most points to the wide receiver position. Boyd, who was wide receiver 21, he's seeing 8 targets per contest. I think he boils over this week. He goes for 7 catches, 70 yards, and a touchdown.
With Gio Bernard sidelined, Mixon has averaged 18 touches per game. A top 11 fantasy producer in 2 of his last 3 games, the second-year running back has looked good, evaded numerous tackles per game, and ripped off some impressive breakaway runs. The game script didn't always go his way in Week 7, thank you Ginger Fist, but he figures to rebound nicely versus Tampa Bay, especially if Gerald McCoy continues to miss time. I'm fearlessly forecasting 105 total yards and a touchdown. After posting top 10 fantasy numbers in Week 6 versus Atlanta, it was Atlanta, y'all, Peyton found his way onto 25% more fantasy rosters in Week 7, and then promptly cratered back down to earth with just 30 yards on 11 carries. Ouch. To be fair, Barber did get hurt in the Bucs' eventual win versus the Browns. Currently, we don't know what's ailing Barber because the super sneaky Dirk Cotter has refused to release the info. Keep an eye on the team's late week practice reports. If Barber can't go, then Ronald Jones will be in play. The Bucs travel to Cincinnati in Week 8. I'm fearlessly forecasting 68 total yards and a score.
O.J. Howard has 13 combined targets in Jameis Winston's 2 starts this year. He went over 60 yards in both contests and scored once. The second-year breakout tight end is still pacing for a 900-yard season despite a zero-catch outing amid injuries in the Bucs' Week 4 loss to Chicago. Howard leads all tight ends with 30-plus targets and yards per route run and gets a great matchup in Week 8 to keep up that hyper-efficiency. The Bengals have allowed an NFL-high 48 catches to the tight end position as their linebackers continue to struggle in pass coverage. Howard is in a clear smash spot in the game with the third highest total on the slate. I'm fearlessly forecasting 5 catches, 71 yards, and a touchdown. Over the last 2 weeks, CJ Uzomah ranks 3rd on the Bengals in air yards, has played on over 91% of the team's snaps in each game, and is tied with Zach Ertz for the 3rd most routes run among tight ends with 69. At the tight end position, that kind of opportunity is about as good as you're going to get outside the top 2 tiers. Uzomah's a good start once again in Week 8 as he heads into a matchup with the Bucs, who have just been ripped up by everyone through the air, tight ends included. I'm fearlessly forecasting 4 catches, 51 yards, and a score.